Boris Johnson and Ed Miliband have a lot in common, you may be surprised to hear. And indeed, Ed Davey too. They all believed that British energy policy was directed towards producing cheap energy, which was secure, and was on a world-leading track to decarbonisation. They may have differed about whether it's 2035 or 2030 the electricity system was going to be decarbonised, but none of them had any doubt that what they were creating was a world leader, a clean energy superpower, and that this strategy was more than simply being altruistic towards the world on emissions. It was also going to create this vibrant, competitive UK economy, which was going to be able to swipe the field with leadership in cheap energy and therefore in industrial competitiveness. Boris Johnson went even further, and in an official document he actually wrote that the leaders of China and Russia will be looking to the UK to work out how to do it. What a remarkable degree of arrogance, and how flimsy and empty that now looks. Because the reality is that UK energy now is not cheap. It's about the most expensive in the world. What an achievement. It's not homegrown, as Mr. Miliband would want us to believe. In fact, it's almost entirely reliant on foreign supply chains, foreign critical minerals, rare earths, and of course nearly all of it is foreign financed and remarkably foreign owned too. No homegrown here. And secure, well, you just have to look at the exposure of the UK system and look at the cables, the interconnectors, the increased reliance on imported oil and gas instead of domestic production. And you can see that this is not a secure system. Indeed, to make it pretty clear where we've got to, it turns out that although the cost of solar panels has of course come down a lot, not so much the cost of wind turbines and offshore wind, but these costs have been falling. But these aren't the system costs of having intermittent energy on your system. So if you look now, we currently need twice the capacity to deliver the same amount of energy that our system used to provide. We used to need about 60, maybe 70 gigawatts of capacity to make sure the lights would stay on when there are peak demands. Now we need 120. That's a hell of a cost addition. And in addition, we need twice the grid to produce the same amount of energy. And then, of course, you have to add on all the batteries, the storage, etc. And when you put all that together, it's pretty obvious that whatever the merits on carbon grounds of what we're doing, and these are not quite as they're presented, the chance of producing a cheap energy superpower are pretty close to zero. And we're only just beginning, because we're going to add more and more intermittent power onto the system and require a lot of gas to be standing by idle and yet pay for it. And as we put the wind farms in particular offshore off the northeast coast of Scotland, we've got the problem of how you get all this stuff to market. Little notice, but an incredibly important cost and rising very sharply, is the fact that we pay for wind generation which we can't and don't use. Wind is often constrained off the system. In Scotland, it can be 40% of the time. So think about this. Wind generates about 40, maybe 50% of the time. And of that time it generates, less than half the time, 40% isn't actually useful yet until all this grid infrastructure is built to connect it to take this power south. It's just a category mistake to put all this wind in the northeast of Scotland and expect that it's all going to be cheap. It just isn't. So these are the facts. What makes the position even more worrying is that this isn't temporary. There are many people who argue, well, there are some costs up front in getting renewables going, but hey, the marginal cost is zero and power prices have come tumbling down now, not in the 220s, but in the 230s. It's rubbish. The costs aren't going to come tumbling down. And the reason the costs aren't going to come down is because the government is providing contracts. The fact that a wind turbine may generate at zero marginal cost doesn't mean that we're paying zero for it. Quite the contrary. We're paying these so-called contracts for differences, which are struck repeatedly above what the wholesale market price is. And as these contracts become to dominate more and more of the total costs that we face in the UK, especially going into the next decade, it doesn't really matter whether the price of gas falls to zero. It doesn't matter if the wholesale price falls to zero, because the policy that we have in place has protected customers from benefiting from lower gas prices or lower wholesale prices. They're going to be almost irrelevant to the total cost you pay. You're going to pay for all these contracts the governments are signing. And they're not just signing contracts for the short term. What you have to bear in mind is that the government's now going to sign contracts for wind, particularly offshore wind, for 20 years. That means that if they sign a contract at, say, £120 a megawatt hour, £110 a megawatt hour, you're going to be paying that until at least 245. And that means that effectively these costs are going to be with us for the first half of the 21st century, having been with us already for the last decade or so. So what we're doing is locking in high-cost wind and, to an extent, solar, and locking it in for the foreseeable future. And the only way out of that is to renege on the contracts, that's a big deal, or add other policy instruments around to ameliorate those costs. Put the costs on the taxpayer. That doesn't make cheap energy. It just means that taxpayers pay what customers would otherwise have had to pay in part as part of these costs. And then there's nuclear. You know, there are very good reasons for building nuclear power into the future. But there isn't much of a good reason for building one at a time and seeing whether they work. And that essentially is UK nuclear policy. You couldn't make this stuff up. It's about the most expensive way to develop nuclear power, and that's why we have amongst the most expensive nuclear power stations in the world being constructed. It was actually slightly worse when Hinkley was brought forward, because the idea initially was to try 4 different sorts and see which one works. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realise that if you really want to do nuclear power, it's no good building one and bearing all the costs of doing that. You either build none or you build lots. The French built over 50 nuclear reactors in their initial programme, and at one stage they were building 6 simultaneously. Can you imagine that in the UK? So what we've done is chosen the most expensive route forward. And what that tells you, in round numbers, is it's between 10 and 15 billion pounds per 1 gigawatt of nuclear generation going forward. Again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realise that this locks in high costs for a long time to come. So, faced with this unpleasant reality, we might think that the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State of Energy trotting off to Brazil to COP30, flying all the way there, of course, with tens of thousands of others, driving on the new motorway cut through the Amazon rainforest to a summit headed by a country that wants to be not just in the top 10 oil producers in the world now, but wants to get up there into the top 4. You really can't make this stuff up. And they're going to go there, and if they repeat what British and other world leaders have done at the last 29 COPs, they're going to tell us how they're saving the world, turning the corner, we're going to fix the climate, etc. Really? What they should be going there is saying to the world, not, we expect, as Boris did, that China and Russia and all these other countries are looking to us to how to do it, to our world leadership. Instead, they should be saying, look what's happened in the UK, don't do it our way. This is a lesson to you about how not to do the climate change policies to address this existential problem that we confront. Because nowhere in the world is anyone going to embrace climate change policies which make energy really expensive, relatively and absolutely. This isn't the route to addressing climate change going forward. They should go there with humility, explain how we got to where we are, explain why our energy prices are so high, explain why they're locked into the future, and why we've become so dependent on external supply chains, external finance, and foreign ownership of the development of our systems. That will be honest, and you can be absolutely certain that's not what they're going to say. And behind that, they also ought to point out it's not just that we've got very high energy policy, but the high energy costs are doing great damage to the economy more generally. We are not just closing down energy-intensive industries, steel, petrochemicals, fertilizers, and so on. It's not just that things are going, it's that not much is coming. Nobody in their right minds who needs competitive energy prices would think the UK is a sensible place to locate future production now or right through the 2030s into the 2040s. That's not what's in front. And of course, what we've actually done is radically cut our carbon territorial production. Actually, not quite, because Drax doesn't count, and Drax is highly polluting, but never mind. But at the same time, having cut out territorial carbon production, we switched more and more to implicit and explicit importing of carbon-intensive products from elsewhere. And that's what Europe's been doing too. It's an illusion to think that the UK has found the world-leading way to address climate change and therefore carbon consumption. It's found a way of using the statistical framework that the UN uses to present the UK as doing particularly well. But no one is really seriously thinking about coming to the UK to find out what to do. And indeed, what should we do now? What are the options going forward if this stuff is largely baked in to permanently high energy costs? One possibility is simply say we're just going to be a very high cost energy economy and we're just going to have to specialise in things for which energy is not relevant. Be careful, because the world is still 85% dependent on fossil fuels. There is no transition globally from fossil fuels. And in the UK, it's about 75% because we've got out of coal by switching to gas. So it's not obvious what industries are immune from the indirect as well as the direct costs of high energy going forward. The alternative is to face the facts and think about how we could radically change direction. And radically change direction without giving up on trying to address global warming and global climate change. But that means addressing these contracts head on. That will mean, as was used against the North Sea oil and gas industry, using the tax system more generally. And yes, it will require renegotiating these contracts. And people say, well, you can't do that. The answer is, we'll have to, because in the end, the bills will not be affordable and the economy will not withstand it. So if we really are serious about turning around the British economy, if people really do want a competitive economy, then in order to promote the growth that the government and the opposition claim that they want, we will have to set electricity prices, particularly on the industrial side, at the competitive level, and we'll have to swallow the difference between the competitive level and the cost that we've baked into the system. And that would require radical change. Don't hold your breath.